In this video lecture, we will look now into gastric secretions. In gastric secretions, we would be looking into the secretions of esophagus and your stomach. And we'll also look into the regulation of gastric secretions and its various phases, right? So let's first look into the secretions of esophagus. If this is how esophagus looks like, right? It's connected to the stomach, right? And we know that the only function of esophagus is to propel food towards stomach, right? And to propel food towards stomach, your esophagus should be smooth, right? And this smoothness is provided by the mucous secretion, right? So esophageal secretions are entirely mucous. There are no digestive enzymes that are secreted in the esophagus because no digestion takes place in esophagus, right? So esophageal secretion is entirely mucous, right? So if we talk about the main body of the esophagus, right? Main body, that means the complete esophagus, it is lined with your simple mucous glands, right? Its main body, if I show you here, main body of esophagus, right, is lined with simple mucous glands. Simple mucous glands, right? But if we talk about the initial portion of the esophagus and the end portion, that is towards the gastric end, right, where we have junction of stomach and the esophagus, which we call as esophagogastric junction, right? At gastric end, which we call as esophagogastric junction, right? Gastric end and initial portion, we do not have simple mucous glands, but we have what we call as compound mucous gland. Compound mucous gland. What is the difference between these two? The secretions of compound mucous gland will save the esophageal wall, right, from the food. If there is anything that can affect the esophageal wall, the secretions of compound mucous gland will save it, right, or will protect it. And towards gastric end, if we talk about, we know that sometimes, or in some people, the gastroesophageal sphincter, right, which is somewhere here, the gastroesophageal sphincter is weak, due to which contents of the stomach, which contains acid, because stomach has hydrochloric acid, which is highly concentrated. So the acid contents will reflux or move back into your esophagus, right? Acid contents will move back into esophagus, and we call this disease as your acid reflux. Simply we call it acid reflux, or we also call it as gastroesophageal reflux disease, right? So the secretions of compound mucous gland will protect your esophageal wall from acidic gastric juices, right, due to acid reflux. And these acidic juices that are refluxing into your esophagus wall, right, they may cause peptic ulcer, right? Instead of these compound mucous glands, we still see conditions of peptic ulcers in your esophageal wall due to acid reflux. Right, now let's look into our main gastric secretions, right? The gastric juice composition. I'll just take it off. Right, gastric juice, what all it consists of, right? Gastric juice is mainly the secretions of your stomach, right? Secretions of your stomach from its various parts. Various parts means fundus, body, and your pylorus. Right. So your gastric juice, if we talk about its secretion per day, an individual secretes 1.5 to 2 liters, right? 2 liters of gastric juice per day, right? And what are its contents? What are its contents? Let's quickly look at its contents. Its contents mainly consist of your organic solutes and your inorganic solutes, right? And water. You have water, then you have inorganic solutes, and you have organic solutes, right? In organic solutes, we have enzymes that helps in digestion, and enzymes like pepsin, right? And you have gastric lipase. Pepsin helps in the digestion of proteins, right? It helps in the early digestion of proteins in stomach, and gastric lipase helps in the digestion of triglycerides or lipids. We call it as lipids. Then you have gelatinase, right? Then you have very important intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is also secreted by your parietal cells. Intrinsic factor is secreted by parietal cells, and your pepsin is secreted by your peptic cells, right? And in inorganic solutes, we have first hydrochloric acid, which is secreted by parietal cells, right? Then you have sodium ions, potassium ions, and bicarbonate ions, these 3 things. Right, now let's look at the secretion of these organic solutes and inorganic solutes, right, in the stomach. Just clear it off. Firstly, if we talk about the entire surface of the stomach, right, the entire surface of the stomach is lined with mucus secreting cells. It's lined with mucus secreting cells, right? And their main job is to secrete mucus, right? And what does mucus do? Mucus, right? I said that the entire stomach and the entire stomach surface is lined with mucus secreting cells that secrete mucus, right? So what mucus does is, we know that inside stomach we have acid, hydrochloric acid, right? And this thing might come in your mind that since you have acid in your stomach, then why doesn't it burn your stomach? The answer is that you have mucus secreting cells also. There's too much mucus secretion inside the stomach, right? So the moment your stomach detects any food, right, it will start secreting mucus, right? And mainly all the secretions, right, the gastric secretion is when the food is present in the stomach, right? Due to the presence of food only, your gastric secretions will start. So your food basically stimulates the gastric secretions, right? I'll write it over here. Food stimulates your gastric secretions, right? Now, what does this mucus do? This mucus inside the stomach will form a barrier, right? It will form a barrier between the acid, right, and the wall, the stomach mucosa, right? Stomach mucosa. Mucosa is the layer of the stomach which is in direct contact with the contents of the stomach, right? This and your HCL. There's a barrier. This barrier is between your HCL, hydrochloric acid in the stomach, and your stomach mucosa, right? So it prevents the stomach mucosa from coming in direct contact with the acid, right? Now, let's look at the various glands. We know the secretions are done by cells that are in various glands, right? Now let's look at the glands that are doing secretions in various parts of the stomach, right? So the stomach mucosa, right? The stomach mucosa has two glands, right? Stomach mucosa has two glands. The first is, right, stomach mucosa has two glands. First is your oxyntic glands. Oxyntic means oxy. Oxy means acid forming. So these glands have cells that produce acid, where that is hydrochloric acid, right? And a moment back we started that hydrochloric acid is secreted by by parietal cells. I'm sorry. And so parietal cells are there in your oxyntic glands, right? We also call these glands as gastric glands, right? And these glands are in body and the fundus, and these constitute 80% of your stomach, right? And your oxyntic gland, you have mucus secreting cells, right? Second thing you have is peptic, right, or chief cells, right, that secretes pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is inactive form of enzyme pepsin that helps in protein digestion, early protein digestion in your stomach, right? And remember, the in stomach protein doesn't get completely digested. It forms peptones and proteases, right? Peptones and other polynucleotides, right? So these these proteins, I'm sorry, is not completely digested. Complete digestion takes place in duodenum, right? So pepsinogen, when is an inactive form of pepsin, right, which becomes active. It will become active only when it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, right, which is secreted by parietal cells. So when pepsinogen comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, it will form pepsin, right, that helps in early protein digestion in stomach, right? Then you have your ECL cells, right? ECL cell is it's your enterochromaffin cells, right? And what these cells do, enterochromaffin-like cells, right? What these cells do is they secrete histamine, right? The job of ECL cells is to secrete histamine, right? And histamine further stimulate parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, right? So important. ECL is important. These cells are important. And you also have D cells that secrete somatostatin, right? So these are cells and secretions of oxyntic glands, right, that fall in body and fundus part of the stomach, and they constitute 80% of your 80% of stomach, right? Now, if you come to the distal part of the stomach, you have pylorus here, and pylorus has pyloric glands, right? So let's see what pyloric glands secretes. Right, pyloric glands, which is located in antral portion of stomach, right? It covers 20% of your stomach, right? And what kind of cells you have? You have mucous neck cells here, right? That secretes mucous neck cells will secrete mucus, right? That will help lubricating the food. The second thing that you have is your peptic cells, your peptic or chief cells that you have in gastric glands as well, and they secretes pepsinogen, we know that. right? Then you have, very important, you have G cells that secretes hormone called as gastrin hormone, right? It secretes gastrin hormone that helps in the regulation of gastric secretions. How? Gastric hormone will, these gastric hormone will stimulate ECL to release histamine, right? And histamine in turn will stimulate the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, right? So G cells, the secretion of G cells is important in gastric secretions, which is your gastric hormone, right? Now let's talk about, we'll be talking little on the secretion of hydrochloric acid, right? Details of hydrochloric acid secretions, how parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid. Now you have surface mucous cells, right? Surface mucous cells, should go through this. Surface mucous cells, we have just little talked already about it. Surface mucous cell, right? Between the glands that we've talked about, we have a continuous layer of special types of mucous cells called simply surface mucous cells, right? It protects the stomach wall from acid, right? Like we discussed before, it acts as a barrier between your stomach wall, mucosa, and hydrochloric acid. So it protects stomach wall from acid and lubricates food. And very important thing is, right? First point is it protects stomach wall, right? Second thing is it is alkaline in nature. Alkaline in nature, right? And you know that you have highly acidic environment inside the stomach, so this alkaline mucus will help, right? So it is alkaline in nature and your underlying stomach wall is not directly exposed to highly acidic, right? Highly acidic stomach secretion. You have alkaline mucus also between, right? And whenever in the mucosa, right, in the stomach mucosa, you have food, right? Any slightest contact of food, right, or any kind of irritation in stomach mucosa will cause secretion of this alkaline mucosa, alkaline mucus, I'm sorry, right? So whenever you have food inside or any irritation in the stomach wall, this alkaline mucus will start secreting, right? Irritation might be due to something acidic, right? So that this alkaline mucus will again protect your stomach wall. So like we have already gone through, just remember this thing that only food in the stomach will stimulate the release of gastric juice from gastric glands that we have gone through, the pyloric glands and the surface mucous cells, right? Only the presence of food in the stomach will stimulate these secretions from the glands. Now the second most important thing is hydrochloric acid secretion. I have a nice diagram here. Right? This diagram shows the structure of parietal cells, right? Canaliculus. You see these canaliculus. Hydrochloric acid is secreted in these canaliculus, right? Hydrogen ion and chloride ions are separately secreted in this canaliculus, right? And from these canaliculus, it goes into the lumen. Right? So let's quickly see how hydrochloric acid is secreted. Let me just clear this off. Right? This is your parietal cells, right? This is your parietal cell, right? And what happens is inside your parietal cell, you can see this water. Let me just change this. Right? You can see this water, right? Water dissociates into hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions, right? Now, this is happening inside the parietal cells, remember, right? And things are moving inside and outside of this parietal cell. This is what we are about to talk now, right? Some ions will move out, some will move in. And this is achieved with the help of proton pumps, right? Hydrogen potassium ATPases, right? That helps in the active transport of potassium ions and your hydrogen ions, right? Active transport of hydrogen ions into the lumen while bringing the potassium ions into the cell. It's done with the help of the proton pumps, right? So hydrogen ions from water will move out, right? It will move out, and in turn potassium ions will move inside the stomach. I'm sorry, inside the parietal cells, right? So the hydrogen ions, right, will be secreted in the canaliculus, right? Canaliculus that I've just shown you. I'll just show you again. Water will dissociate to form hydrogen ions and your hydroxyl ions, right? These hydrogen ions would be secreted. This would be secreted in canaliculus, right? And will move out. These will move out of parietal cell, right? And in turn, you can see it over here in the diagram also, the potassium ions, right, will move into the cell by potassium sodium pumps, ATPases pump, right? Now when this potassium will come in, it has a tendency to leak back into the lumen, right? But it would be recycled back into the cell by hydrogen potassium ATPases, right? Now you have this proton has been moved out, right, is secreted in the canaliculus. Remember that this hydrogen ion is in canaliculus. Now you have hydroxyl ions, right? Hydroxyl ions will form water, right? You have water inside, and you have carbon dioxide also inside the parietal cell. From where does this carbon dioxide come? It has come from metabolism, right? Metabolism, where you take in oxygen, form carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is thrown out. So water will combine with carbon dioxide, right, to form H2CO3, right? Now H2CO3 is again the source of protons and will form protons and carbonate ions, right? Now these carbonate ions will move out, right? Carbonate ions will move out, right? Now something will move in. What will move in? You can see it over here. The carbonate ions are moved out, right? And chloride ions in turn will move in. You can see this. Chloride ions will move in, right? So chloride ions will enter the cell and are secreted into the canaliculus, giving a strong solution of HCl, right? So I repeat, these OH ions will form, along with carbon dioxide, will form carbonic acid, and this is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase. It's an enzyme. This is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase, right? And you have proton, right? Right now, carbonic acid is again a source of protons, and you have bicarbonate. I'm sorry. This will move out. This is alkaline. This will move out, and in turn, chloride ion will move in, right? And this chloride ions that moved in would be secreted into the canaliculus, right? Chloride ion that moved inside the cell would be secreted in your canaliculus. Now you have chloride ions in canaliculus. Earlier you have these hydrogen ions in canaliculus. Now in the canaliculus, hydrogen ions and chloride ions will combine to form HCl, right? Which is secreted in the lumen, of the cell, right? This is how hydrochloric acid is secreted, right? This is important. Make sure you know it. Now let's quickly look into the regulation of gastric secretions, right? I already gave you hint of regulation of gastric secretions. I'll just quickly show you a diagram right? And I'll just note down some important points. I said that in pylorus, we have pyloric glands that have G cells, and these G cells secrete hormone gastrin, right? And these hormone gastrin would be transported to the enterochromaffin-like cells, right? ECL cells of the stomach, right? So gastrin hormone would be transported to ECL cells of the stomach, right? And when they are transported to the ECL cells, the gastrin hormone will stimulate ECL cells to release histamine, right? In oxyntic glands, right? In oxyntic glands. Oxyntic glands are gastric glands. Now, when histamine is secreted by ECL cells, this histamine cells will in turn helps in the secretion of or stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid by parietal cells, right? So we have three things that regulate the gastric acid. That we have three things that regulate gastric secretions. You have acetylcholine, right? You have histamine, right? Then you have gastric hormone, G hormone, gastric hormone secreted by G cells. Now, histamine is secreted by enterochromaffin cells, ECL cells. This is secreted by G cells in pyloric gland. This is in oxyntic gland. Acetylcholine is secreted by parasympathetic nervous system of the brain, right? You can see here, right? Okay, acetylcholine, which is secreted by parasympathetic nervous system, right, will excite secretion of pepsinogen by this acetylcholine, right? It will excite secretion of pepsinogen by peptic cells, right? And HCL we know by parietal cells. Then you have mucus by mucous cells, right? I repeat, the regulation of gastric juice is done by acetylcholine secreted by parasympathetic nervous system, histamine secreted by ECL cells, gastric hormone secreted by G cells, right? Now your acetylcholine will excite secretion of pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, and mucus by the respective cells, and histamine, right, will stimulate parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, right, which in turn are secreted. Your ECL cells are stimulated by your gastrin hormone, right? Your ECL cells are stimulated by gastrin hormone, right, to release histamine, right? Gastrin hormone, which is released by G cells in pyloric glands, right? I hope this is clear. This regulation is clear, right? Just remember that acetylcholine is simple, right? Parasympathetic nervous system will release acetylcholine that will excite the secretion of pepsinogen, HCL, and mucus by the respective cells, right? Now the G cells in pyloric gland, right, will secrete hormone gastrin, which in turn will stimulate ECL cells to release histamine. Histamine in turn will stimulate parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid. That's it. And this is simple. You can see it over here. This is your G cell, right? G cells are releasing gastrin, right? And gastrin are going to your ECL cells, and they will stimulate ECL cells to release histamine, right? Now histamine will cause parietal cells, this is your parietal cells, right, to release hydrochloric acid. Similarly, you can see this parasympathetic nervous system that will release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine will force or stimulate secretion of all the three things that we have just discussed, right? I'm sure you are clear with it. Now, what you have is phases of gastric secretion, right? Let's quickly see the phases of gastric secretion. So the phases of gastric secretion is in how many steps the gastric secretion takes place. It simply means that. The first phase is your cephalic phase, right? So cephalic phase is the moment you think of food, right? Or the moment you see food, the gastric secretion will start, right? The process will start. So the cephalic phase occurs before food enters the stomach, right? And it results from sight, smell, taste, and appetite, right? And the cephalic phase will constitute 30%, right, of secretion, right? And this is controlled by your brain. This is caused by the cephalic phase, right? That is the secretion in the cephalic phase by the sight, smell, or taste of the food is caused by cortex, and in the appetite centers of the amygdala and hypothalamus, right? Remember, this is caused by cerebral cortex. I'm sorry, I used the term cortex earlier. It's caused by cerebral cortex and in the appetite centers of amygdala and hypothalamus, right? And it constitutes 30% of gastric secretion. Second is your gastric phase, right? This is your gastric phase. Now, gastric phase occurs when food enters the stomach, right? So when we have just said before that whenever your stomach detects food inside, it will start secreting, right? So this is your gastric phase mainly. So this occurs when food enters the stomach and causes secretion of gastric juice, right? And this will contribute 60% maximum, right, of gastric secretion. Then this phase, gastric phase, is regulated. You can see it is regulated by local nervous secretory reflexes, vagal reflexes, and gastrointestinal stimulation. So gastrointestinal stimulation is also taking part here. Right now, you have the third phase, which is this intestinal phase. You can see this intestinal phase. Now, intestinal phase is when food enters the intestine. It's simple, right? So when food enters the upper portion of small intestine, particularly the upper portion is when the food leaves stomach, it goes into duodenum, which is the first part of small intestine. So when food enters upper portion of small intestine, right, particularly in the duodenum, the small amount of gastric juice continues to be secreted, right? And this is regulated by nervous mechanism and hormonal mechanism released by duodenal mucosa, right? When food enters into duodenum, right, the outer layer, which is, the layer which is in contact with the contents, that is food, that is your mucosa, right? So duodenal mucosa will release certain hormones that will regulate your intestinal phase, right? So I hope all these three phases are clear. Intestinal phase, the first is cephalic phase, right? The other is gastric phase, cephalic phase when you just see the food. Gastric phase when food enters the stomach, it causes stimulation, right? And your stomach will start secreting. Now, when the food moves into your intestine, into your duodenum, you still have secretions, right? You still have little gastric juice secretion, right? Which is your 10%. And it is regulated by your nervous mechanism and your hormonal mechanism. I hope all this is clear, right? This lecture is important for gastric juice secretions, right? And I hope this is clear. Thanks